behave? Are we are we actually living out the way that we say we're going to, or was that just words? So for me, I'm kind of really tuned into almost like how is it designed at the outset, and the signals we can send that actually encourage people to be brave, encourage people to say what's not working. Because if we don't celebrate the failures, we're burying them. And if we're not having those open conversations, there's a lot that we're not dealing with. We're just sort of squirreling it away. And I think it's easier to get into talking about the failures once we've talked about some successes. So to me, it's a package. And I think really I need both to actually sort of have the motivation that is going to carry me through those spells where maybe it's feeling tougher, which is, I guess, what I think resilience is.
Daph, how about you?
Yeah, I was just going to prove a point. Well, I'm so goal-oriented and milestone-oriented that I'm doing this run today because it's in my app. So I set up, I wanted to do a half marathon at the end of this, summer, really. And I've done a few before, but all pre-pregnancies. And I said, okay, I want to do this. How am I going to do this? How am I going to be disciplined enough? How am I going to have small wins? And I realized I need a coach, but I don't want to get a coach. It's too, sorry, too much effort. But so I got an app which gives me that coach, and I'm doing it, even though today I probably shouldn't be. But it's just like, it's there. I can do it. It's not much. I can get a little high and a little check. And recently I had that with a nonprofit Craig had started helping to found, I want to say 5 years ago, 4 years ago. And we had it founded and everything. We had pilot customers and everything. And then it just still did what you said, Jeff. It didn't move. And I felt I was doing something, but also not enough. But also felt like the weight wasn't pulled equally from others as well. So I didn't see activities, I didn't see actions, I didn't see milestones which were realistic. So everything was missing for me, and there was no action, and there was no even tiny successes. And then after, I think 2.5 years or so of running it, I said, guys, you go ahead, continue, but this is draining my energy. So I think wins for me are giving me energy, giving me hope, giving me outlook, and the lack of it. So I applaud you, Simone, and you're so resilient on your own. I can't do it. It's like when somebody's not talking for 20 seconds, it's really hard for me. I need action. So lesson here for me is, why do I need it? And can I maybe, be self motivated and enduring that lack of success, lack of feedback, maybe even failure. So there's something for me I want to investigate. So thanks for bringing that up.
I want to go back to also, I mean, I used to work for the government. That was my first job with the Department of Education. And there was a real culture of blame. So, if you had a failure, either you didn't bring it up or you shoved it under the carpet because there was always this fear that, you would be held responsible, it would hold your career back. There was this massive fear of failure. And the result of that was that there was very little innovation. And I would say that is true in Singapore as well, because people are afraid to make mistakes. People are afraid to fail. And as a result, a lot of organizations become quite stagnant in their thinking. And if we don't allow for that failure, then, we never move forward. We just, do what's safe. And I found that I was coaching a group last night, and that was the case before. I think with their old CEO, people were very much in fear of doing anything wrong or doing anything new because they'd be afraid to fail. And if they failed, they'd get blamed. So a lot of it depends on the leadership as well. So if you know if you have a leader who's willing to let you fail and not blame you for that and not, have your career be affected directly by that, then you're more likely to actually allow yourself to make those mistakes. And I wonder, I mean, how many of you have been in organizations like that that would that actually allowed you to fail?
I think there's something very powerful about celebrating successes and failures in terms of cultural creating or shaping cultures, sending messages.
And I always say maybe it was Sounding Boards, the first company that at least when I started said, we're celebrating you getting fired from client engagement. Even though I got fired or half fired about a month ago and Bill fired also about a month ago, and I didn't feel that was a lot of success. I felt more guilty, and I also didn't feel like there was any celebration around it. So this might be me, this might be a different climate, but I would say this is the first organization that I've been part of that at least has something about promoting and celebrating successes and failures.
For me, just sort of sharing that I like the way another program I've been on talks about it. And I think it really changes the energy around this quite a lot. And the way that she describes it is they're experiments. So talking about it as an experiment is to learn something.
Mm.
Doesn't matter so much what that learning is. Obviously, you would like it to be in the direction towards something, but to me, that kind of language is quite interesting in terms of how people perceive it. That's why I think when Sounding Board uses the name Leadership Labs, same logic. So I think there's that. And I think the second thing I would just share, I was on a coaching call today, large organization, supposedly quite fast growing. And her perception was, this particular leader, that she can't innovate because there are too many rules about how things need to be done, that actually it suffocates any kind of choice, and it has to be something that works everywhere, which of course means very few customizations are allowed for a specific customer or region or location or whatever. So again, I'm a little bit back to that. Are you saying it or are you living it? And that's just kind of what I keep coming back to.
I want to move everyone to the whiteboard now and do a little exercise. And I apologize for not hitting the record button early enough. So we're going to move to that breakout challenge. And let's see, we can do 2 pairs. So if you analyze a past project that involved both failure and success, what were some of the lessons learned and what were the celebrations? So if you were part of a team, or you were part of a project that involved both some degree of failure and some degree of success, can you talk about some of the lessons that you learned from that and the celebrations? Now, do we need to do it as a breakout or would you like to do it as a group? I know Adam was big on breakouts.
It doesn't bother me either way.
Okay,
So if
let's
that's a preference.
let's do it as a quick breakout then. So 10 minutes, look at a past project, involve failure and success, lessons learned, celebrations. And we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Hi, Brian.
So I'm just thinking about a team or a project. Do you have anything in mind, Jess?
I think if I use the thing that I'm doing currently with this group, what's working in success and failure, that's the question, right? And the way that I'm trying to look at it, because I feel like I'm with people who are really afraid of failure and making a decision. How do I do like little micro steps to make it comfortable so that if it's a failure, it's not too big of a failure. So I'm like, I'm going to put a table together that offers 3 options so that, you know, to ease the potential for failure so that it doesn't feel that risky. That's kind of how
Is this a group you're coaching or you're part of?
No, this is the group that I'm part of,
Okay.
the ICF group that I'm part of.
I'm just curious by what would equal failure anyway? Is failure no growth?
Or is it losing $1 billion?
How likely is that?
I don't know. I feel like I have a couple of clients who are pretty micromanagey, and it's both because they're like, I'm dealing with millions of dollars, so I can't trust anyone else to do this besides me.
Interesting.
Well, if you're Elon Musk, losing $44 billion isn't a big deal.
Yeah. Well, I'm always like, okay, well, what's low-hanging fruit? Let's not go for the millions of dollars, but how can you start gauging their critical thinking and leadership on low-hanging fruit?
Right. Yeah.
And do we like what I considered my failure from the thing last week? I couldn't have guessed that it would be a failure, right? Like, so how do we use our critical reasoning for what might be a failure, because we're also human and doing the thing. So we think we know we're not going to try and fail at something, but the thing that we usually fail at is the thing we would never anticipate failing at.
But I'm curious just as well, sometimes it only is a failure in this instance, and actually in the future, when we look back, it might not have been a failure at all. It might be something that's moved us towards something. So that I think failure and success can be quite subjective, and it can be quite time oriented. So I'm just kind of thinking about, you did this thing, you created awareness. Maybe that awareness didn't instantly crystallize into an upside, but that doesn't mean it never will.
Well, and you know what's funny about this too with failure and success is that if I look at this webinar that I did last week, 2 people were like, you clarified concepts in such a simplified way that I had never thought about, yada, yada. This was great. Your knowledge is so incredible, yada, yada, yada. One person was like, I'm a newbie. I didn't understand. You were speaking that language. You went too fast. You were I had a hard time. I got there, but I had to jump from 1 to 1. So why do I focus on the person who had the harder time versus the 2 people who were like, this was great and super successful?
Well, and that also brings up for me just a piece around audience. Do you target the people who are more advanced and say, this isn't for newbies?
which therefore created, it's going to be two paths. How new are you versus how advanced are you? But the person who had the most negative voice was the voice that spoke in my head all night.
What does that say?
Well, that I want to be focused on the, you know, the where there's fault. I want to be perfect for everybody.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's we focus on the place where we feel like there's the biggest upside. So overcoming weaknesses rather than cementing strengths, because it's not as juicy as an. So if you got a 10% gain on the up, that doesn't feel as good as, well, I turned around a 50% case and made them 100.
Love that.
I'll share a slightly different example. So I came to the end recently of 2 team coaching engagements. The stakeholder for the 2 teams is the same and is a former client or a current client. So the 2 teams from the diagnostic that I did both progressed very well. In terms of actual sort of business performance, one did better than the other. And I asked them to do a feedback survey. And what was really interesting was I did the output sessions. Great job. Here's what we've noticed, improvements in most aspects, blah, 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 blah. And here are the gaps. So the stakeholder with both team leads said, look, we've got a job to do. Let's note down where the biggest gaps are, because clearly the team aren't necessarily feeling the same way that we do. Great. And then in a subsequent conversation with the stakeholder, I said, look, remember that the deal for doing this on a discounted basis was that you were going to give me a testimonial. So here are just some things to think about. So he wrote back to me and he said, great experience. Really appreciate all that you've done. I just think we spent too much time on the touchy-feely stuff. And like we really could have moved through the trust and the psychological safety quicker. We didn't need to keep banging on about that. So it affected me because I am touchy-feely. That's who I am. And I'm like, that's an interesting choice of expression. And I thought, well, yes, okay, you've got the power. Yes, you got me the opportunity, but I'm not going to let that go. So actually, I challenged back and said, look, that's your perspective. I said, but notice in the feedback that the team members had a very different perspective to you, and the team leader had a middle position between the 2 of you. So like, it's really hard to know what's enough depending on those different audiences. So actually, failure and success was relational to the individual or individuals, and you can't necessarily assume that that looks the same for everybody. So that was a really big learning. And actually what I took from that was I need to be more confident in saying, here's what it looks like for me.
You know what I love about that, Craig, and this speaks to me too, is if they had said to you, I feel like you were more focused on the tactical piece and we spent way too much time on the tactical piece because that isn't the heart of who you were. If that would have had the same impact that it did because it was the feely piece, which is so much of who you are in your heart. So it felt like a personal attack versus if it was the tactical, you might have been like, interesting perspective. How do I want to shift that? Yada, yada, yada.
I think it does press some buttons because I've kind of always been labeled as too emotional or overreacting. So there was a little bit of that going on. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I thought, well, do you know what? That's me as a coach. So if you don't want that as a coach, I'm not the right person for you. I'm not going to apologize for that anymore. And that felt like a big shift.
Yeah.
You know, hearing that, Craig, it sounds like you were absolutely the right person for that team, because it's a perspective they'd never considered. And they always wanted to, okay, you know, that's that touchy-feely stuff. Let's move past it. And if we do move past it, what are we going to lose in the
Right.
long term?
And like trust and safety are so foundational to everything. And I know Matt's like runs at 100 miles an hour and wants to do everything yesterday and wants to get outcomes because he's on his career trajectory. And I get all that. But the simple reality was the team don't feel the same level of trust and safety that he does because of his position. And the interesting thing was in another setting recently. So there's some signals the universe is sending me. When I went to this retreat, it was more women than men, but it was a bit of a balanced group. But probably out of everybody, I was the one who was most expressive with my emotions and some things that had happened in my past. And I had two separate individuals, one man, one woman, come to me and say, oh, could I have a chat with you? Because I really appreciated your courage in talking about that. And I'm working through this thing. And I just wondered if I could talk through. And so it's not something that everybody is able or confident to do. So absolutely, I'm not going to stop doing it.
And we're not robots. I love what you're saying right now. And even it's helping me reframe that night where I was in a circle of a loop. But when we were talking about it earlier, I'm like, do I have that feeling now? I don't. I've evolved beyond that. And just how you were saying, yeah, I had this moment of thought around it. And then I evolved through it because I've done my work. That doesn't still affect me the way that it might have, because maybe 10 years ago, you would still be in this negative spiral of what do I have to do now? Yada, da, da, da. But we're meant to have emotions of all spectrums, and it's what we do with it and how we move through it and how we get to this point where it's like, now it's just a story that can help serve others.
And what that has me thinking about, Jess, is AI can kind of fake emotions. It'll get better at faking emotions, but it works on, well, in my head, it works on assumptions that emotions are somehow rational and logical and that they follow a set pattern and that can be programmed. And that's not true. So if we really want to be human and if we want to support other people to be human and combat a lot of this loneliness and isolation and all those issues, the only way we can go is to really understand and get better at working with emotions in a really honest and real way.
Yes.
You know, Craig, so what you just said brought something to mind when I was at the AI conference. And I think I might have shared this with you, Jess. The little graph that showed that AI actually beat doctors on empathy on a massive scale. I mean, the gap was huge.
Wow.
So
because they don't, AI doesn't have it doesn't have
it's faking emotions.
It doesn't have, yeah, it doesn't have this underlying subconscious beliefs that are pervasive throughout how it's going to show up.
But then people felt the perception was that AI was being more empathetic than the doctors were.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So even if you're pretending to have emotions, the impact that that has on the individual can be quite profound.
This might be a segue, but it's coming to my head, so I'm going to say it. Like, I think that the thing that I'm constantly trying to remember, especially with my teen, is that all of his emotions, it's riding on something. It's about how he feels. It's his stress. It's everything. And everything I feel is, right, where is my power? How is he, where am I as the mother? Yada, yada, yada. It's about how do we strip that? But I love what you're saying about the AI, because the AI can just be empathetic without adding its own story of they're saying this, that, therefore it means this about me. No, it's just saying I am true. It's how we can be as coaches, I think. I can be so empathetic in the room because I'm not putting any of my own story onto anything
Yeah.
that's happening.
Detachment.
We can be detached from that while being empathetic.
Yeah.
And I wonder if,
doctors are not.
I wonder if that's why doctors aren't showing that empathy, because they do get too involved, and that has an impact on their emotions in the long run.
Yeah.
Well, and then we're back to success and failure, right? Because if people die, that's a pretty big failure.
Yeah. Or if you get sued because you do something wrong or you think it's the wrong thing.
It's interesting. So in the power call earlier, they were talking about two industries having, or two verticals having particular sort of characteristics. One was healthcare,
Mm.
and the second was academia.
Mm.
And I was like, actually, this feels different around that, because essentially there they were talking about, because as an expert, so it was more to do with expertise and knowledge and experience. And the more you're seen as an expert, the less scrutiny you're under, really, to actually back up what you're saying, because people just assume you're an expert and you know.
Yeah.
Whereas anyone junior has to be like whatever tested and sort of validity and all that stuff.
You know what? That's so interesting, because at the very same conference, we had a lot of experts on different panels, and they're all saying, we don't know. We really don't know where we're going. We don't know what's going to happen. So don't take our word just because we're experts.
Well, I love
But that scares me.
People who are like, we live and die by science. And I'm like, if you looked at science today versus science 100 years ago, it's a whole different ball.
Yeah.
So you're basing everything on your absolute.
But that's the whole point about science, though. We don't know. And the goal is to find out.
And it's all shifting. Sorry, go ahead, Craig.
Yeah.
No. And I was going to say, and absolutely. But are we not going to put any parameters around that? Like, because my concern is, if I think back to the days at the bank, if you were really smart, there was no way you worked for the regulator. You worked in the banks because you'd make a ton more money and you'd be much more successful. To some extent, those that were less successful would end up at the regulator. And so is there really that sort of oversight? That's the bit. I mean, it's like, yeah, we're trying to sort of improve things, and I get how good AI can be, and it's going to make us much less biased and all this great stuff. But I wonder, in this world we live in that's so divided, who is going to pull together to oversee? And how are we going to have those conversations about any boundaries that there need to be? Because if we don't, all sorts of ethical stuff's going to just get. And I mean, I was reading an interesting thing, I'm sure you'll know about it already, but where basically it was growth at any cost, regardless of the ethics of how they were actually programming in the data. They didn't care, because it was all about getting big quickly.
Yeah. And we see that over and over again.
Right. I know personally, like even LinkedIn, I have a total bias. If I feel like it was written by AI, I just go right by it because it's so obvious to me. But I will go to AI when I'm curious for my own personal thing, and then I will look at it. But because I know it's running through whatever bias they're doing, that I'm like, tell what's human and what's not.
Interesting.
I think we can bring this conversation back to the main group. So I'm going to close the rooms, bring us back. So what was the flavor of your conversations in the two groups? So Simone and Daph, maybe you want to start off?
At some level, we were talking about personal versus in the organizational context, and contribution to culture versus quality of life as the lives we want to lead. Maybe also that it's like when we talked about, I was talking about a failure and a success. You mentioned a project, and the thing that came to my mind was like 2 holidays I'd been on with my partner and his kids, which had the highs and lows. But I said I was nowhere near celebrating any of the lows. It was more about debriefing that, like, that didn't happen again. Like, have we learned something? But also not celebrating the highs, like enjoying the highs of the highs, but not celebrating the fact that we had. So I guess there was also a discussion around, like, what do we mean by success still, and things to appreciate versus achievements, and framing for self versus framing for others, the value of both and different in different contexts. Yeah, I'm debriefing. We do more debriefing in our own lives than celebrating, perhaps. And I was saying that I would like to do good things I enjoy, just because that is life, not because I've necessarily achieved anything or had a success, but because it's my life. I think I should live it better.
Well, isn't enjoying life celebrating life?
Yeah, totally. But that's celebrating life, though.
Yeah.
Versus celebrating success or an achievement. Yeah, totally.
Craig and Jess, what about you guys? So our discussion went off on a tangent to AI as well.
Very interesting. Yeah. We were just, I guess, thinking in a similar way to you, Simone, around like what is success, also what's failure, and is that assessment, depending on the perspective of the person making the evaluation, is it necessarily the same for different individuals or teams? And then we were also thinking about the role that maybe the passage of time plays. So something that may feel like a failure at the time could actually turn out to be a success, because although you didn't get an immediate response, maybe you got one a month or 3 months down the line that you weren't anticipating. So actually it wasn't a failure at all.
And to add in how our emotions play into that, of what we assign to ourselves, like the core of who we are, how that plays into what we deem failure or success as well, where something that might not be as important to us, we might not deem so much as a failure or not be that concerned about.
Okay.
And how, in a way, it's not so much the failures that we celebrate, but the learnings of the failures.
Right.
And I do think it's important to, if it's in a context with others, to set the right tone, like what it is we do want to encourage, like not sweeping under the carpet or shaming. There's an opportunity to set that tone amongst others.
Okay. So I want to just bring it back to the last part of the session and some accountability for ourselves. So pick one of those sticky notes in terms of accountability, and look at what you'd like to commit to over the next couple of weeks and the next month. Daph, can you see the whiteboard?
I can, and I'm logging in my computer as we speak.
It's not letting me add to it though, Brian. Is
No,
anybody else having that issue?
What do you mean add to it?
Like I can't do anything on your whiteboard.
Oh, okay. That's fine. So you're just actually looking at the 5. You're not going to need to add anything to it.
There's nothing on my whiteboard except for it says add a sticky note. That's it. I can't see
Really?
any other. Yeah.
Can
Does
you
anybody?
see? Can you see the file? Can you zoom out or zoom in?
Does anybody else see anything on the whiteboard?
I see the 5 stickies,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, me too.
but I'm
Okay.
looking at the screen share. I'm not looking at any links.
So it should only be the screen share on it.
Well, continue as it. I don't know why it's not working for me.
Let me take a screenshot and then
Yeah, good
maybe
idea.
you'll be able to access that. One sec.
And you want to put that in the chat then, Craig?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There we go. Learning from a failure.
Thank you for sharing.
Do you want us to share, Brian, which one we're going to do?
Yes. So an insight and an accountability prompt, if you would.
Okay.
And I'll close this in a minute. Can I close the whiteboard?
Good for me.
Yeah.
Are we verbalizing what we're going to do?
You're verbalizing what you're going to do.
Okay, I'm going to do the orange one about the team commitment. And so for me, it's about normalizing, I think, in the team that I'm working on right now, about what we're working on and how to ease through successes and failures.
Cool. And an insight that you've received during today's session?
I always get a lot of insights from these, Brian. But I think I loved what Craig said about how, I forget how he said it, but like when we have a failure, we focus on not the person who only has a 10% failure, but the person who has an 80% failure, where we perceive will have the most leap towards success. And so how to modulate that and focus on what it is that I'm really wanting versus focusing on an individual's success or failure outside of myself. That makes sense?
Perfectly.
Thank you.
So for me, the biggest insight was that while I teach, and I was saying also this morning in my, leadership training, we got to celebrate successes and failures. And I realized, I have not celebrated any failures. I've done debriefing. So I want to be more conscious about that, and maybe and that comes to my accountability, the next sort of failure share, and not just keep it with me. So I'm not quite sure yet how I'm going to share this, because it depends a bit of what the failure is. So I still feel a bit fragile about this. But if there's something about, hey, I do debriefs, I do learnings, that's all great, but walk the talk. I cannot teach about, celebrating successes and failures if I actually do not do it myself.
I can go next. Mine's quite similar in a way to Daph's, which is I think the thing that struck me as the insight was around not allowing too much time between wins and breaking it down. So actually thinking in relation to my own work, there's a lot of different things going on and I can get lost quite easily. So actually maybe just picking one win per stream per week and just focus on delivering that. And then I think really sort of being more intentional in my reflective practice to look in depth at not just the wins, that's easy, but actually also the sort of the learning opportunities from what didn't go so well and trying to be objective. And Simone's got hers in chat.
Yeah, I think for me the insight was that I zapped too quickly the successes or the wins, the points to appreciate as well. So I think sharing them is a way to create a moment to dwell might be an exaggeration, but to mark them, connect to them.
Cool. You had 2 hours coaching in French, did you? Wow.
Somebody working in a hospital with loads of issues as well. So yeah, funnily enough, I did that, but it's not something I do every day at all to say by myself saying I'm proud of this.
Okay, thank you everyone for really enlightening and engaging session once more. When we come back in 2 weeks, we are looking at the final session. So the final session is going to be focusing on how do we create resilience for the long term in teams? What do we need to do to sustain that resilience? So it's well and good building all of that up, but maintaining it is going to take a lot more effort and a lot more energy. So what do we need to do that? So I will put the dates in for 2 weeks from now. I think it'll be your Wednesday this time rather than my Wednesday. So I will hope to see you then. Thank you, everyone.